go ahead and subscribe. I may not be around long. In this episode, cancel culture comes for me because I'm exposing my own racism and toxicity. All of my life, I've gaslit myself on intelligence and learning because I'm not a scientist. I look at people like my wife, who's absolutely brilliant in the realm of health and biological sciences. I look at friends of mine in various industries where things like math and science, the subjects I never seemed interested enough to excel, are the foundations. I'm a writer, a speaker, a performer, a creator, a thinker. For what my laboratory lacks in Bunsen beakers and burners, it's overabundant in people, places, and perspectives. My science is the social science. With undergraduate focuses on human communication and sociology, along with the theater arts, where I'm trained to study people, and post-grad focus on human development and learning, what's coalesced in my being, along with my unique journey through trauma and mental health, and an almost savant-like gift for seeing patterns, I'm hoisting the mantle of social scientist. And you all have been my subjects. My apologies, but hey, on the upside, you might be in the book. In this series, The Politics of Dancing, I'm exploring the twisted tango I've done around the realm of political ideology. And no dancing around the hard truths either, those uncomfortable stories. How did I get from small-town, small-minded bigot to educated, enlightened, and progressive? Over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm breaking down my roots, the very foundation of my raising, and what indoctrination led me to some of these toxic ideals. I hope you can't, but maybe you'll relate. I'll discuss some of my most humiliating realities of my past, my racism, my homophobia, my xenophobia, my misogyny, my bigotry. I'm digging deep and dismantling some of the deplorable thoughts and ideas I've had about other people. I am breaking down bigotry and bias and suppressing supremacy. I'm pointing out the prejudice and eradicating the entitlement of toxic white Southern culture. Overthinking everything about it. Deconstructing my culture of cultism. I'm going to lay out my case that America is dumbing us down and numbing us down. I'll explain what that means and how that's been done for decades. The intent will absolutely sicken you when you find out why. And welcome to the podcast. Before I get too far into discussing my own horrible behavior, let me just say that I didn't know where to start on this because the issue isn't as simple or superficial as it might seem I'm laying out in these episodes. If I can preface this, let me say that this is my perspective based on 40 plus years of observational data. This is experiential, and I'm coming to some conclusions that might upset you. I also explain those, so please stay to the end and watch the rest of the episodes in this series for full context. I do not mean to simplify America's original sin, nor do I mean to condemn an entire swath of people over blanket statements. I believe that there are many in this country who speak their racism, many more who show their racism, considerably more who don't show their racism, and a vast majority of Americans who aren't even aware of their racism. This is everyone, every race, every person. My claim is that it's impossible to exist in America for any extended period, much less be born here and not have some sort of attitudinal, philosophical, or ideological influence by American culture, period. That racism, racial injustice, inequality, and inappropriateness are at the core of who and what this nation is. Our entire culture has steeped in that hot stew of hatred, getting teabagged by white supremacy for hundreds of years. We may not admit it or even express it verbally, but within each of us in America lie the seeds of bigotry, bias, prejudice, and racism. It's how we're subliminally taught, not just by school, but family, communities, entertainment, media, politics, religion, and in just about every facet of American society. The stench of it lingers. In many, education, experience, diversity, and critical thinking bypass the bigotry. But for others, it's in their subtleties, their body language, their microaggressions, and the hints of hate they aren't even aware they're expressing. The issue of race in my culture, toxic white Southern culture, is complex and convoluted by whitewashed history, mistruths, and a culture that prides itself on not being too smart while surrendering themselves to some form of cultism or another to justify their abhorrent attitudes. What I'm going to discuss here is painful and deeply embarrassing, but I feel like it's important that I open myself up this way so that others might feel empowered to do so as well. Or maybe just hear how I got from there to here. If it helps just one. Or maybe this is where I get canceled. We put people into baskets, compartmentalize them all the time. It's judging or observation, it's labeling and dividing, but part of it is how we process data. Part of it is not. Caucasian, because unless I talk, how do you tell me from a Scot, an Irishman, a German, or a Russian? And some of it isn't sinister, except that if we don't have diversity in our immediate sphere, and that's likely through some of our own choices, both conscious and not, then it isn't that we just compartmentalize and label for the purpose of identifying. It's that we're building over bias before we even start. Diversity breaks down bigotry. The more you're around other people not like you, the more you understand they are people like you, and the less you see them as not like you. The Aesop fable about the fox and the lion. Without that immediate diverse bubble, we fall prey to our base instincts, which are taught to us, or they're the ones we picked up early on in our development. But the process of expanding your bubble, seeking diversity, is hard, awkward, and uncomfortable. The simple fact that you're seeking out specific types of people to know for the sake of knowing one, well, that's problematic too. But I'm offering this thought for everyone. We're in a critical point of transition. And that means we all have to be a little uncomfortable. And that sounds very unfair to a group of people who have been very uncomfortable for a very long time. But rest assured, a grace period for some awkwardness within acceptable boundaries, of course, might be warranted. If we just wait for some people to just wake up one day and be okay with certain things they and their generations prior have traditionally struggled with, that's just us not wanting to be uncomfortable while they're uncomfortable. And I'm just saying that let's be open, all of us, regardless of our labels, to be honest, authentic, genuine, and earnest in our attempts to cross lines. Now, don't confuse that with crossing boundaries. If someone who is racist and clearly problematic is genuinely trying to understand why what they're saying is wrong, maybe we should try to discern that from those seeking to justify the attitudes they're unwilling to back down from. When we allow these conversations, it's vulnerable and uncomfortable. Sometimes it's like saying the same thing over and over. It's maddening. Like I said, I'm not one for reruns. Except this, watch this over and over and over. We must remain open to bridging our gaps and healing our divides. My hope is that we are all uncomfortable for a short while during a phase out of organized white supremacy. Who knows if we could ever stamp it out altogether, but we can root it out systematically and ensure nothing we do, legislatively or otherwise, is done for the purpose of oppression or discrimination. Don't you wonder why we all can't agree on that? My hope is that we all have to squirm in our seats while a lot of folks deconstruct their own hateful ideals so we can move on from them. And maybe if we do this, the next generation won't have to. I feel like some of your parents said the same thing. Maybe theirs too, for that matter. I can't speak for every recovering racist out there, but what I know is that we hide from what makes us feel bad and run toward things that make us feel good. A joke, even a racist joke, can release chemicals and have someone laughing before they're aware and processing what was said. The mere act of everyone laughing can elicit laughter. Have you ever found yourself in a crowd cheering, ha ha, laughing, asking yourself, what is this for again? Feel-good happy chemicals are addictive. The guilt or uncomfortableness, that sort of the world is caving in on me and I can feel the heartbeat in my ears kind of feeling where you aren't the least bit suicidal, but you really just want to be dead. Choose your own adventure, kids. I think I know which page is getting worn out here. We don't want this episode. We don't want to step back, even if we say, wow, this guy's a real schmuck, but at least I've not been that bad. Then we have to reckon the that bad aspect of our statement. Maybe you've never experienced anything close to what you're about to hear. Just know these attitudes and ideas I'm about to express in this episode are not solely mine. Those we oppose may not have identical paths, ideas, ideals, or experiences, but I assure you there's enough in common for statistical significance. So, I make this episode about me, which I know is not really interesting to you since you probably don't know me yet, since I wisely decided that episode should come in the back half of the season. I'm not so narcissistic that I need an entire podcast about me. I'm pretty fucking interesting. I mean, I could tell a story, but this is about you, us, all of us. But I can only really tell my story like this. And if I'm going to tell on people, I need to tell on myself first and foremost. I can't stand on some pious pedestal of the moral high ground as flawed and horrible as I am. I don't speak down to the low of character. I'm really upset because it used to be nice and quiet down here until you all decided to move in. I'm saying when I am the one having to say this, it's gone too far. For me, being around someone who was different meant I had to watch what I said. And if I slipped up, I was going to be the one embarrassed. Which only meant what? Yeah, I knew what I was saying was shitty. I argue they all know. They all know every time something is shitty. It's that they've justified their way around it morally. They're okay with it. Some folks feel a challenge when something is hard. They go ham until they master it. Others back down and try to go around the obstacle. Our bias, bigotry, prejudice, those are our obstacles. Those first flashes of thought that come into your mind that you don't tell anyone. A cultural Rorschach test. You shake them off because you know they aren't productive. It annoys you because you don't know where they come from or why they're still in there. Well, I got tired of asking why. I'm digging into why. This is overthinking everything. You think of it like this uncomfortable fight or flight response I've spoke about in previous episodes. We're more comfortable with our own, so we see more of our faces and more faces like ours. It comforts us. We feel like we're not alone. But we need to see more faces not like ours, and we do that by opening ourselves, our circles, up to new and diverse people, places, and experiences. Now, this is teetering into that I have a black friend territory, but this is why that's a punchline. We're indoctrinated into a cultism that roots into some of our earliest ancestors who settled in America generations ago. And even if your people don't share this heritage, the ideas and attitudes have very much become an undertone of our culture. That cultism in particular is more akin to the Scottish clanism, Germanic and Northern European tribalism too. It's very protective of what is in your bubble, and also very fearful and suspicious of what isn't. We're more comfortable with our own, so we gravitate to our own. We still segregate ourselves, it's just illegal for someone else to segregate us. Sometimes it's comfort, and in some instances, instinct to flock toward the most relatable figure in a crowd. So it might not necessarily be that we're uncomfortable around another race, so much as we're more comfortable around our own group. That's like diet soda. You don't get the diabetes, just the rotted teeth. Part of toxic white Southern culture is the notion that they all look alike. That's a statement I've made many times in my life, trying to be funny some of the time. And of course, yes, I regret it, but with no flux capacitor, let's deconstruct why I said this, and worse, why I thought it. I said it because I heard it. That's simple. A big part of cultism is mimicking what those above you, those in authority, do. And when something's funny and gets a reaction, like a toddler, we keep striking for that dopamine. The feel-good chemicals are addictive. So that's why I said it. Why did I think it? Don't assume it's any one particular group either. I've heard it said about most every we could think of. So let's discuss why they all look alike. Think of this like racial face blindness. It isn't always that it's easier to recognize someone from our own category. It's that we've been conditioned in one way or the other to discount, disregard, dismiss things that make us uncomfortable, even if those things are people, or groups of people, or types of people. This is a trauma like PTSD. Imagine, subconsciously, you're uncomfortable around a certain group of people or a type of person for whatever reason. It's like being involved in a crime. Your memory will get blurry and you might confuse details in that panicked state. Anxiety is just that inner panic. The trauma response and ripple effects are similar. So when you have an interaction and it goes a little awkward, even if that's just internalized, you can start to rework the details and framework of your reality before you're even aware it's happening. This is why we have perspective. My side, your side, and the truth. 3 sides to every story. There are the events as they happen, then how each person experiencing those events processes them. That becomes their reality. I argue a lot of narcissists don't register their narcissism because their brain is trained to cope by rewriting history. That happens so much in some people that they simply just become this person who behaves with no regard for others because no one holds them accountable, not even their own brains. It's hard to pick out the sinister from the simpleton. Sometimes this idea that they all look alike is bathed in self-centeredness as much as bigotry. I'll argue that many cases of just non-toxic, non-race-related face blindness are selfishness. We're simply self-absorbed by nature, right? We don't consider other people, regardless of looks or labels. Sometimes it isn't that they're black or white or Asian, it's just that we're not paying attention to anyone but our phones. My father taught me, when you meet someone, shake their hand firmly, look into their eyes, say their name, and then your name. Smile if it's appropriate, and study their faces. This was mostly from my dad's sales experience, or his experience as a con man. But I assure you, he taught me well. It helps. Except that, just like any other step-by-step work, it only works if you work it. I ordered takeout from a local ethnic restaurant we enjoy a while back on the back end of the COVID pandemic. I was playing on my phone, self-conscious, because I left the house basically in my loungewear, and even though I was wearing a mask and I don't really care, you know, part of me does. I see the guy who normally greets me. From the back of the restaurant, he waves and lets me know in our own physical and verbal shorthand, my food will be ready soon. I pay another man for the food, so by the time the food comes out to me, I'm a little hangry and really just focused on getting home with the food. I said, "Thank you, sir," as I looked down to grab the bags. To the lady who brought me my food. The lady. And in this instance, I was actually sort of self-absorbed. And a similar stature and general body type out of my periphery. I didn't bother to look up the extra 15 degrees to see past the outstretched hands of the bags. It was just an awkward chuckle and Now this was innocent and a result of my rudeness, my preoccupation, not racism. Except I'm willing to peel it back. I know how I was taught. I know the things I heard growing up, jokes or not. So how do I not know that at least some of that dismissiveness didn't stem from that? That somewhere in my head I heard when I was younger, why do I have to press 1 for English? And today that manifests in a bias against someone who can't communicate on my level. And that prompts an anxiety about communicating altogether. That anxiety leads to a dismissiveness, and in the past, maybe an agitation that sort of became a self-fulfilling prophecy of animosity. You know, where you have this chip of ignorance on your shoulder going into an interaction that completely clouds that interaction from the start and sets that interaction up for the conflict you just knew you were going to have when you walked in. No? Never had that one? I'll let you dwell on that. We'll circle back to it. Maybe put it in the comments. Allow me to explain my own toxicity for just a moment. Hopefully you won't relate. Something tells me more than a few of you will. Regardless of race, this has been my truth in the past. In the case of fill-in-the-blank ethnicity or origin, for the sake of the restaurant example before, let's go with my feelings years ago regarding specifically my Latinx friends. You see, because I, the expert communicator, couldn't communicate, I felt very insecure. I felt inadequate on a deep level. Communicating is what I do, and to challenge that area of expertise is to challenge almost everything I know about how I value myself. And because they knew something I didn't, I was on the defensive. That meant they were smarter than me, and that bugged me because, well, the atmosphere I grew up in was one that made me feel like being inferior was wrong. In fact, the atmosphere I grew up in may not have been one of meetings in the woods white supremacy, but it certainly was an attitude of white superiority. And because the fact that I wasn't willing to take the time to learn a new language, that made me feel bad because apparently Raiden's movesets on Mortal Kombat were important enough for me to learn. And because I struggled with all of these internal thoughts, who's to say my reaction wasn't responsive to those anxieties and traumas? Trauma. It's going to come up a lot in this series because that's what racism is. That's what all of this is. Poor little old racist me couldn't see past my own inadequacies and insecurities to realize the tremendous struggle of someone giving up everything they have and to come somewhere where they don't speak the language just for a shot at survival. Like seriously, the fuck do people not understand? They don't put it together that living in a trailer full of 30 of them is not a racially stereotyped slur, but a statement to step back on and say, shit, man, what life sucks so bad that living like this is optimal? And then the ripple effect thoughts that come from that. Nah, it's just about how I can't understand a goddamn word they say. Forget how I would feel if I were in a strange place with only my skills and no way to communicate what those skills were, my needs, or anything. Just trying to survive. What if I told you that part of bigotry is inadequacy? There's a lot to it, and we should shelve the hate stuff for later. That's a lot harder to unpack. But the less destructive but equally harmful traits of bigotry need to be examined. I've noticed that toxic traits have stemmed from fears and lies reinforced with oppression and negative stereotypes. Those fears and lies come from others, those in positions of influence or power. The oppression is more systematic and is less about race than it is about class. But race is used to stoke the fires, drawing our attention away from the issues that would unite us against a common goal: justice, equality, equity, and a more fair economy for everyone. Those stereotypes, though, can come from different places. Books, movies, music, TV shows. Like I said, I grew up in a town where there were no African Americans. When I moved straight from there to Nashville after watching Sanford and Son, Good Times, other shows like that, what ideas do you think I might have of African Americans? If that's complemented by negative influence or racist comments and ideals by authority figures, sure, I had Cosby. But he was the guy from Fat Albert, Pudding Pops. I knew his comedy before I knew his TV show, and as time is told, not a great example. But let's dig into that a bit. Even though they had a nice house and were a strong, positive, and healthy family unit, a doctor and a lawyer with well-mannered children, I didn't see the race. They were also well-spoken. I know what I said, but it sure was part of it back then. The Cosby Show wasn't about black people because those black people didn't fit into my confirmation bias. So I just didn't see Cosby as being a very black show. In that, it was a normal show that had black people cast as the main characters. Amen, another good example. The ideas of ghettos, projects, poverty, squalor were the norm without the nuance as to why these things were stereotypes. It was that when I was presented with an example of what a black family was, a family, that somewhere in my mind they didn't register as black, but for all the wrong reasons. It isn't that I didn't see color. It's that I did. I just didn't want to see any color that didn't fit into what I already thought. I knew they were black people, but it wasn't a show about black people in my mind. If that can make sense, I had this disassociation with the blackness of Cosby because I couldn't relate to it. Having not been exposed to a lot of it, I never learned how similar we all are. So all I got was different and then fight or flight instinct to process however I could or shut out the challenging ideas entirely. And no, I don't like the well-spoken microaggression. Personally, I always take it as a compliment. When someone says, I speak well, clearly, etc., it is the highest praise for me as a communicator. For others, it's different. That statement made to a white man, even if it's laced in bigotry against regional accents and dialects, and even if that in and of itself is also somewhat a knock against non-standard dialect as less classy, less educated, or whatever, it's still different when said to a person of color. The fact that I didn't have to spend a lot of mental capital discerning what they were saying meant a lot. The slang and cultural isms made it difficult to easily process on some shows, and we sort of flock to the easy, don't we? This is a big hurdle in entertainment, crossing over to other cultures, whether we want to admit it or not, especially in music, which I'll discuss later. Now, why else would I disregard the blackness of Cosby? My family was in a shambles. I hated where I came from and a lot of the people from whence I came. I wasn't proud of much growing up. And I know that sounds shitty, but it's just a fact. I was grateful for what I had. I was appreciative. I really was. But I was embarrassed and not proud of where I came. I wanted to be from somewhere else. I wanted us to be somebody else. So when I saw a family getting it right, my brain had to find a way to accept this show, and I found so comforting and entertaining while not disrupting my fragile reality. I had to mentally whitewash it, whether I knew it or not. I don't think my brain would have allowed it any other way, because I wasn't programmed for equality or equity. So it didn't become a show about black people. It was a show about people who were black. And I know that sounds, oh, he doesn't see color, but no, don't get ahead of ourselves. In my mind, it was a show of black people so black people could see what was possible. It was fairness because there were black shows and white shows, and rarely did the two shows intermingle. And if they did, it was usually the other stereotyping it up on the opposite show. Now just think long and hard about that. The exceptions to that rule were few and far between. So why was Cosby, this show I watched, along with A Different World, such a catalyst for my awakening? It wasn't then, but now I see some of what I missed out on in the experience because of how and where I was raised, because I didn't know any black people who lived like that. Well, guess what? I knew black people who lived much nicer than I did. I just didn't know them because I didn't try. Or I wasn't the kind of person they felt safe knowing. Either way, I'm 100% positive that my trauma shut down the blackness of The Cosby Show because I was more comfortable with black people living in public housing or a junkyard. Those were black shows. Cosby was just a black family playing white. And I'm sad to say that ignorant and self-centered, privileged and superior perspective, not just one I had alone. I'm aware of it. I'm willing to open up and admit it because I want to end this. And I feel like we end it by explaining why we felt the way we did, talked the way we did, believed the way we did, even if it's the most uncomfortable thing you've ever done. It seemed for every positive minority influence, if I could even find one between the thicket of my bigotry, there were these negative stereotypes reinforced as well. The stereotypes were comforting because they were familiar. They often tickled the good brain chemicals, and if I looked, I could see those stereotypes being validated by that group, and I didn't feel bad about having those ideas. After all, if you are the stereotype and we all know the stereotype, then isn't it your fault for living up to the stereotype? That's how I rationalized my humor back then. Every time I saw someone living up to one of these toxic stereotypes, it justified and validated my opinions, ideas, and comments, jokes as on the table. If they don't even care about the stereotypes enough to rise above them, then you can't blame me for using it for laughs. Yeah, like I said, toxic white Southern culture, entitled and privileged, but too daft to see it. What I've learned is that trying to take in the music or media of a specific culture or group, not your own, without a healthy point of reference, a grounded point of reference, Among this treacherous sea of subliminal stereotyping, it all runs the risk of being very caricature-ish. And if you're not careful in a closed-minded environment, you're not going to see the parallels of life struggle in a show like Good Times, or how reflective it is of your own life. You're just going to look at that show and go, damn, these broke ass sure do live in a shitty apartment, without looking away from the TV to see your own broke ass, comparably shitty apartment. Because we are trained to look down on people different than us. And get ready for this one, because I heard it repeatedly growing up. Well, we may be poor too, but at least we ain't. Yeah. And call it cognitive dissonance when it comes to our own shows like All in the Family when I was growing up. We had shows about lower income or working class people, but Who's the Boss, Growing Pains, Family Ties, those were more the norm than Roseanne and the Torkelsons, which were all too relatable for me. And I still thought I had it better off than them. Sorry. Dan Connor or the dad from the Wonder Years, they were great and all, but in my reality, those guys beat the hell out of their kids. You know it, I know it. TV is fake, it's saccharine. Or it used to be. I didn't see many examples of how I lived on television. But still, I saw people who looked like me doing anything I could imagine. There was no limit to what I could find in entertainment to relate to, at least with basic physical identity. So many of the people I know who look like me grew up like this. Very closed, limited perspective. Even those who grew up in more open-minded settings, if you really will take a hard look, you're going to find it difficult reasoning that there wasn't some imbalance along the way. Those imbalances can be traumatic. Much less constant stress or exposure to that level of toxicity and ignorance. Not to mention the exposure to the cold lack of compassion. Compounded by the oppressive tone of our culture, let's just ask a question. Give me a percentage of people of color in this country over the last 60 years or so, whom you think would stand up for themselves in a room full of white people. If that number is not 100%, we have to be open to the idea that sometimes we make people so uncomfortable they'll laugh at themselves just to keep from an escalation. Sometimes people take the abuse just for a chance at peace when it's over, sometimes just for a seat at the table. Fighting back starts an endless war. Taking it temporarily means the storm may blow over soon. Until the next storm. Like Jesus, we're made to suffer, right? The notion that people are just now standing up, decrying PC culture, no, you dick. It's just that we're finally seeing how toxic our attitudes have been allowed to become. It isn't political correctness or even cancel culture. It's an opportunity for personal correction. Because when we push the lines of decency and acceptability, it never returns. You just create the new normal. That's what conservatives fight for, holding that line. Because Ellen coming out on TV paved the way for RuPaul's Drag Race, gay kids and kids shows, gay marriage, and a genderless potato head. And kids who don't know if they're boys or girls. That's their slippery slope mentality. And by conservative logic, they're not altogether wrong. Pushing that line broke down walls. Now, I grant you those walls should have never been up. They were put up by conservatives, and conservatives got too comfortable cowering in fear behind those walls. And the good people didn't speak loudly enough sooner, easy for me to say. But too many stayed quiet for too long. Hopefully, the hate train is coming to a halt for humankind. Unless white people give everyone a reason to turn on us. I mean, more of a reason. Let me be clear here once and for all. Muslims are not our enemy. Black people and Black Lives Matter are not our enemy. Antifa stands for anti-fascism, so if you're bitching about Antifa, you're a goddamn fascist, so shut up. You don't get a seat at the table, not in America. Fascists are not American. We already decided this. That's the thing we get to say love it or leave it for. If you want fascism, you go somewhere else where there's fascism. I don't know about you, but I am anti-fascism. I don't agree with violent protests or havoc wreaking by any group. I also don't agree it should ever come to that. Eventually, the battered spouse strikes the attacker. I should know. I'm in a lot of TV shows about that stuff. Growing up in closed-minded environments around people who had toxic attitudes and others who allowed these toxic attitudes to foster brought about a chip on my shoulder I've always struggled to get past. It traumatized me. My dad embarrassed me telling his jokes, and then somehow I grew up to embarrass myself telling my own jokes. Whatever it took to stop getting bullied. Trying so hard to fit in and stand out and be anything people wouldn't pick on. I came home with my ear pierced one day. I think I was 12. My dad's reaction was, "Well, you gonna sit down to piss now?" Well, here's a healthy heaping helping of our homegrown homophobic trauma for your 12-year-old trying to figure out who he is. And I gotta ask, why stand up? Some macho look at what I can do bravado? Look, I got a bad back and bad knees. I'm falling apart. Why stand? Seriously. It wasn't the example I think these places and people wanted to leave on me. But it drove me to try to be better than them. Not immediately. I've said and done some horrible things, mostly for laughs. But let's be clear, I'm not immune to this. Where I'm at today? I don't believe in apologizing for things that come out of my mouth after they do, because at this point in my life, you can bet I've considered my words a little better than when I was younger. If I say something that rubs you raw, I offer that it was intended to, and you should probably overthink why you reacted the way you did. I would hate to be punished today for not having evolved sooner, but I also believe in accountability. So while some may cite me for virtue signaling on social media, I don't believe that's it at all. It's that I've been on the other side of this. It's a dark place, an embarrassing place. I was angry going through my divorce. Fighting for my kids, being denied access to my kids, having to pay more in lawyers and child support than I made, or at least it seemed. It was oppressive and smothering. My ex was an untreated narcissist, abusive. When I had all I could take in traditional narcissist form, the tables were turned, and where I showed grace, she showed no mercy. I survived, though, but I recall on a rare occasion my ex-wife, the girls, and I met at the mall after we had split. I don't remember the context. I think it was just a shopping trip for school stuff for the kids. I have no idea what the conversation was. I just remember we passed a store or something, and I unleashed some bit which was just really a racist vent against Indian people laced in poor humor. And it makes me sick thinking about it right now, but because it was vile. Even my ex-wife realized that and called me out. Yeah, called out by a narcissist, but I said these things with no regard for saying them in front of my kids. It wasn't like hateful, but it was ignorant and ugly. Not funny at all. I don't even remember what I said, but it was literally just racism and stereotyping. This is where it gets hard to swallow. Why on earth would I say or even think those things? Off the top of my head, that closed bubble of no diversity. And a poo. As an entertainer, an actor, voice actor, I hate that. I loathe the idea that I have to attribute my past racism and toxicity, at least partially, to a cartoon character. Like Apu and that white guy that played the Indian in Short Circuit, Fisher Stevens. I'm not going to condemn Stevens for taking that role any more than I will C. Thomas Howell for Soul Man. However, in season 2, you can bet I'm going to be breaking down and deconstructing a lot of our entertainment media and how it's influenced our thinking. Apu was a straight, over-center plate stereotype on The Simpsons. He was a key side character in the show and quite popular. Except that he was played by Hank Azaria, who could be any number of things, but Indian isn't one of them. Neither was Fisher Stevens. He was just made up to look Indian, and then he sounded Indian, just like Azaria with Apu. I can't say I really watched The Simpsons as a fan, but I was very aware of Apu. Short Circuit? I watched that a few dozen times at least. Fucking loved robots, and I loved Steve Guttenberg. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you or any Indian out there that They don't have a discernible accent. Most of us, hell, we all have a discernible accent of some type. I have a discernible accent that I've worked years to wash the Southern off of. Mostly for professional reasons. And when I'm behind this microphone, you can bet that unless they ask for a specific dialect, I am straight up mid-American. I can do a lot of accents, voices, and dialects. I shouldn't do most of them, even though I once did openly and freely. And many aren't stereotypical. They're pretty spot on for the most part, with respect. As a voice actor, I never felt right taking a role that would be stolen from someone more in line with that character description. Even though there was a time where if you could pull it off, you can do it. Well, that time is over. Inclusion and diversity are so important because we get fed so many stereotypes. It's vital to feed us a balanced diet of real. If I didn't have black people in my town growing up, I surely didn't see many Indians. Except in punchlines or places that were. And hell, if I'm being honest, most of the time when the subject of Indians came up in my culture, I was asked to differentiate between continental Indians and America's indigenous peoples. I'm sure I don't have to use my hands to express how that was differentiated. I'm sure you already know what I'm talking about. Nor did I have the wherewithal to differentiate the stereotype from the actuality, or the Pakistani, Afghani, or Israeli from the Indian. If you never learn the difference and you're too uncomfortable or pissed off to ask, how do you ever learn? Remember the self-fulfilling prophecy of bigotry I mentioned earlier? Let me explain Indian people. I don't care for calling Native Americans and our indigenous peoples Indians. I will correct you. Indians, as I used to call them, could have really been anything. This is where I'm talking about those generalities and ethnic face blindness. I was irritated about the language barrier. I dreaded it because I felt racist if I couldn't understand them, and I didn't want to ask them to repeat because the accent sounded so stereotypical I felt like a racist if I asked them to speak more clearly. And to be frank, and hopefully not offensive, when someone from India spoke, it sounded so much like the stereotype I grew up on that it tickled that dopamine place in my mind where all the jokes rested. So it was also about trying not to react in that way when I heard it. Directions, the total of my purchase, it didn't matter. Hearing that accent signaled to my brain this feeling from hearing that in an inappropriate manner. It was all so awkward, and then their style of communicating was at times kind of off-putting for my slow, southern, charming, y'all come back now, you hear, raising. Bear in mind, my perception is based on experiences in the convenience store or hotel or doctor's office, because that literally was the extent of stereotypical exposure I had. This is true for most of us because stereotypes exist for a reason, and we often don't care about those reasons, nor do we think critically about why they exist. We just need our bigotry validated. Dreading and expecting friction, no, even looking for it in that self-fulfilling prophecy. The moment when they reveal themselves to me, which is just them reacting to my assholatry, and I get to tell them where to go back to. But the thing is, none of that is genuine. It's all fabricated and built on lies and misinformation, ignorance and bias. It's parroting hateful things you've heard others say, almost like a curse when we stub our toe. It's prejudice and then validation seeking. It's narcissism. The racist attitude is ultimately selfish, narcissistic, self-absorbed, self-obsessed, and all about me. And what we see today from these people in our own culture is very similar. It's just been stoked by their media personalities and emboldened by their political and religious leaders. I can pinpoint specific examples that led to a bigotry against people who I would then criticize as Indian. It isn't just like I woke up and had a bias. The stereotypes and prejudices that I was exposed to helped fan those flames, but my actual experiences framed my attitudes. If someone just stops there, they've validated their hate. They feel better, they move on, but this is where these hard admissions come into play. These same instances could have very well happened with someone who looked like me and sounded like me, and I would have just called them an asshole. But because of the atmosphere in which I was raised, and the limited perspective, and the lack of diversity, the fact that they were different became the thing to latch onto, the low-hanging fruit. For example, on a vacation once, we had to pull over and stay in a hotel. We got a room. It was foul. I mean, there was feces on the wall. It was just unsanitary. The card was already in their system. The clerk or owner wouldn't refund us. He wanted to move us rooms. We didn't feel comfortable staying there at all, especially with the kids. It was a heated exchange years ago. When you're already biased and bigoted, someone being an asshole reinforces those attitudes. You could meet 100 people of that group who aren't assholes, but we aren't seeking that. We're seeking validations for our abhorrent and toxic attitudes. We desperately want to be proven right. So much so that we create the self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict. Because being wrong means daddy was wrong too. Now, that incident at the hotel was negative. Part of that way is a cultural way of doing business, I've been told, but I can't control that. I cannot control the cleanliness of the room. I can only control my reaction. And I devolved into my daddy on that instance. I needed that validation to keep believing what I was taught. And what I was taught, that these folks came from dirty, impoverished lands. They bathed and drank from the same water upstream from the water they dutied in downstream. A lot of negative and just incorrect stereotypes. Movies and stuff like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom didn't do much to change my ideas as a young man. I didn't care enough to dig for truth because truth didn't matter, because that group of people didn't matter, because I didn't know any of people from that group. Now, you can take that entire exchange, every single stitch of that about Indians, and substitute any group, and I think it applies. Hate is generalized. That's what I've learned. We just hate. The specifics of that hate are simply the things we seek out to validate and justify our hatred. We were told when we got bullied at school that the bully doesn't hate us, the bully hates themselves and they're just jealous of us or insecure, something. Why they bully is more about the bully than it is the victim. Now, knowing that doesn't make it better or take back all the pain, but it can help us deconstruct why we feel these things and hopefully move beyond this toxicity. Coming up in part 3, it's confession time. I know, like all of this hasn't been. I'm going to talk about one of the single greatest achievements of my life. I'm going to discuss my legacy, if I'm ever to have one. I'm also going to discuss why that legacy will always be tarnished by my toxic and racist attitudes. I'm going to get real about the one thing that's the hardest for me to admit because it's one of the things I actually do regret. I don't live life with regrets, but if I could have a blue telephone box for this one, I wish I could have accomplished this and not been a toxic asshole while doing it. Still, the accomplishment stands, and so do the memories of my words, actions, and behaviors. This is one of the things I'm most embarrassed about, but it illustrates my journey and the downside to not evolving sooner. So catch up on past episodes of Overthinking Everything and be ready for part 3 of the politics of dancing as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thank you for joining me. Check out all my other videos on YouTube, all separated in playlists for you. Visit my website, joshbrandonmedia.com, and follow me on TikTok. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel so you can see all the videos that I do. Do all the things I need you to do to help me grow, if you don't mind. And if you like me that much, hit me up on Cash App. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.